Speed on camera.
Okay, just go ahead and tell me your name and also tell me what school you attended during the Atlanta Student Movement.
My name is Dr. Amos C. Brown, and I attended Morehouse College.
And tell me, I am doing a little reading. Were you one of the 8 students that took a course?
Yes, I was one of the 8 students in the only course that Dr. King taught during his lifetime. It was during the semester of 1961-62, a seminar in social philosophy. And Mr. Julian Bond and I were 2 of the 8.
And tell me, what do you remember most just from that time in the Atlanta Student Movement?
I suppose the significant thing for the 2 of us is that we didn't come to Morehouse in Atlanta to join the movement. We had already, as youngsters, been nurtured in the civil rights struggle and the human rights struggle in our native communities. Mr. Bond was in Pennsylvania.
Stand by
Hold on 1 second for us while she comes in. Oh, no.
All right, let's jump back into it. We're still rolling. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
You were involved in your native communities.
Yes, Mr. Bond's father was elected president of Lincoln University, the first black president in 1957. And around that time, Mr. Bond was a student at the George Friend School in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And I was down in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, where I had organized the first youth council of NACP in the state of Mississippi following the brutal murder of Emmett Till. And under the inspiration and mentorship of Megna Wiley Evers, I became involved. And Julian was up in Bucks County, and near Bucks County, there was Ardmore, Pennsylvania, where a very dynamic youth council, local and state, was led by a woman named Isabel Strickland. So the NACP really was the foundation, the hotbed, if you please, for our engagement in civil rights activism. But when we came here in for him it was in 57, for me in 59, we came with the fire under our belly because NACP had already equipped us to be, as youth, involved in the struggle for civil rights. And the first student sit-down movement was not in Greensboro. That's a redaction of history. The first wave of student sit-down activities was in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma in 1960, rather 1958, under the leadership of our Oklahoma City, Oklahoma Youth Council, and the president of the Youth Council was Barbara Posey, who's still alive. She teaches at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, and the advisor was Miss Clara Looper. And there was another sit-down movement in Wichita, Kansas, and Louisville, Kentucky. And our protests were written up in the London Times, Tokyo Times, and the New York Times. But the American press thought that this was going to be just a fly-by-night, quick movement. But we fooled them. So that when Mr. Bond and I came to Atlanta in 1960, there was a meeting in the Harkness Hall conference room with the presidents of all of these historically black schools who heard that we were planning on continuing the movement here in Atlanta. Now, mind you, this is before Greensboro. And in 1959, I was elected president of the National Youth Work Committee of the NAACP in New York City. And at that meeting was a young man named Ezella Blair from Greensboro, North Carolina, who was an alternate youth delegate to that convention. It was there that he heard the young people from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, talking about their successes in 1958. And he got fired up and went back to A&T College that fall and tried to get the students there to do the same, but they were afraid. However, February the 1st, 1960, they built up enough courage, 3 other students, to go and sit down. That is the accurate history of the wave of student activism. It did not start with SNCC. It did not start with even Atlanta. It started with the NAACP. But when we decided we were going to move here in Atlanta, as I referenced earlier, the college president said, we're not going to stop you all from fighting for your rights, but at least let the world know why you're doing what you're doing. And it was Dr. Clement who suggested that a committee of us would craft a statement which became the Appeal on Human Rights. And Dr. Mays said, and after you write it, I will raise the money to have it published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I was a part of that committee, and in Marion Wright Elderman's memoirs, she states that on March the 4th, 1960, our caucus consisted of Lonnie King, who was backed by the King family, Julian Bond, Amos Brown, a bright young NAACPer. I was the youngest one in the room. And out of this caucus, we made contributions to that document. And Rosalind Pope was to be the editor of our thoughts. I am proud of that document because it represents a deliberative effort of students becoming involved in a strategic way to fight for not just civil rights, but human rights. Unlike Black Lives Matter movement today, though they have provided a great service, but it concerns me that they need to be more reflective, they need to be more deliberative, they need to be more strategic if we are going to really continue the movement that has been around a long time. For youth have always been involved in struggles for civil rights, but we respected and took the advice, good advice, from our elders. And Mr. Bond and I were always surrounded by elders like Paul Robeson, Mr. W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Benjamin Eliza Mays, Mary McLeod Bethune, Dorothy Height, and many others that time would not permit me to mention. We must stop this divide, this generation divide, if we're going to be effective. In 1960, there was no generation divide. Dr. King was in the room. He was a young man, though. And Dr. Mays, Dr. Clement, Dr. Cunningham, the president of Spelman College was also, Manley there was there. These persons were all our inspiration, our role models, and our examples.
Thank you for sharing that part. I've heard a lot of different, accounts, but I think you've definitely filled in
Yes.
a huge missing piece there in terms of the genesis of it, so thank you
Yes.
for sharing that part. There are some different markers around the city that I'm just gonna kind of go down a list of places, and you tell me what you remember, maybe about meeting those places. If you don't recall, that's okay. I can just kind of keep going down the list. But I wanted to start, one of the things you mentioned was just the American press. What do you remember about the Atlanta Inquirer and the role that it had in the movement?
Oh, that was our means of getting the message out there. And that was the opportunity for writers like Mr. Julian Bond and Rosalind Pope.
You have to make sure he states what it is.
Yeah,
Okay.
you mentioned the name of the Atlanta Inquirer. Just
Yes. The Atlanta Inquirer was very much a pivotal media outlet for us. The established white press wouldn't tell it right, at times would ignore what we were doing. But it was through that paper that many of our fellow students got practical experience in writing and serving as journalists. We can never say too much about how this paper continued Ida B. Wells' tradition, going back to the days of many other persons like George Washington Williams, who was the first black historian, not Carter G. Woodson. Mr. Woodson was inspired by him. George Washington Williams wrote the first history of the Negro race in 1880. And I have a copy of the original publication that will be on display at the new museum in Washington that will open next year near the White House. I cite all this history to say that we've always had persons within our race who were the writers. Others were the speakers, the stormtroopers, but we always had the writers. And that organ, the Inquirer, was our means of getting the word out.
tell me what, when it came to, I guess, the Supreme Court case,
I'm gonna cut real quick.